Fermentation is really exciting from an active product ingredient or API production viewpoint because it does hold the key to the kingdom of the future. If we can cultivate bacteria or yeast that can help us as microfactories to produce these compounds, these APIs, then we have a potential to free up a lot of land mass.
Hello, Joachim from Green Innovation Group here with another episode of the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast, where I talk to my partner from the company, Frederik about sustainable fermentation and how precision fermentation can be used in drug production. Super exciting, and I learned a lot. So I hope you will enjoy the episode too. If you want to know whenever there's a new episode and read more articles that we do or how we work with our clients, you can also sign up for our newsletter at greeninnovationgroup.com. And please give us any feedback. We're curious to hear what you're thinking out there. Enjoy the episode. Welcome, Frederik. Super good to be back with you here on the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. And today we are going to talk about a particular kink of yours that I know you're excited about. Precision fermentation. And fermentation is something that we all know from the food world with beer or kombucha and other things. But it's actually very powerful in drug production as well, and has a lot of sustainability potential. So welcome, first and foremost.
Thank you.
And if we start at the top, what is fermentation, and why is it important for sustainability in drug production?
Fermentation is really exciting from an active product ingredient or API production viewpoint, because it does hold the key to the kingdom of the future.
And what is an API?
An API is the active product ingredient in pharmaceuticals. So when you eat a pill, there's an API inside that pill, and that's the one that does whatever it's supposed to do inside you. So I eat a pill for grass allergies, or I don't eat it. I'm supposed to have it under my tongue, and then wait a bit and not swallow it. So actually, I very much am supposed to not eat it, but the active product ingredient is what's having the reaction with my body and my immune system, and is in this case hopefully making my body not be super responsive towards grass pollen, so I can stop being sick every summer. That's the essence of it. If you have a pain and you eat a painkiller, the API is the active product ingredient that makes the pain go away inside of Joachim. Yeah. So that's kind of the gist of it. And the reason why this excites me so much is that the sustainability potential is just so tremendous in the realm of fermentation. And that's what we're going to talk about, I hope, in this episode.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I mean, if we zoom out a little bit, and if we look at, there's a lot of CO2 emissions coming from the healthcare sector, and a lot of material use, and it's so much actually that we cannot, as a global population, humanity, we cannot reach our climate goals if we don't make the healthcare sector sustainable. And a big part of making it sustainable is fixing drug production. I think for the national healthcare system, for instance, they to reach their climate goals and become net zero, they're estimating that around 20% of the reduction should come from the medicine production and the products that they use, and a very, very big part of that is from the APIs. And essentially you can look at an API as if you make an essence for sauce, fine French sauce. You boil a very big pot, you use a lot of energy and a lot of resources to get a small concentrate that you put into to a pill. And where does fermentation come into that place if we are to make drug production?
Maybe I should start
fermentation
off with
is
explaining
really
a little bit what
exciting
is
from an
fermentation.
active product ingredient
so we
or
kind of
API
get the
production
viewpoint, then I'll get
viewpoint,
back to
because it
why
does
it's important for drug
hold
production.
the key
So
to the
fermentation is the
kingdom of the
process
future.
where bacteria or yeast is turning sugars and oxygen into something else. And the interesting characteristics about bacteria and yeast is that we can actually engineer them or cultivate them to having certain properties. So you probably know beer and bread and yogurt.
Big favorites
and cheese.
of mine.
Kombucha is another fermentation process, and what they all have in common is that we take a carbon resource that is readily available, probably cheap or waste-like, and then we turn it into something else. In bread, we're taking flour from grains, and then we're combining that with yeast, and the yeast is turning the sugars from the flour into what we know as the delicious bread in the end, when it's baked in the oven and it has leavened and all of these things. And in
Shout
beer,
out to our Meyer's Cantina bread, which is
the bread cake.
Yeah, super good.
So that's one thing that happens there, and since the yeast cells and the bacteria are essentially living organisms, they're respirating. So just like we eat carbon and take in oxygen and breathe out CO2 and vapor and heat from our respiration processes, it's something similar that's going on here. And we have in beer production, the yeast cells are famously eating the sugar, consuming the oxygen, and producing the alcohol. So that's
hell of a process.
Yeah, it's something that we all know and can all relate to. And then in yogurt or in cheese, we have a bacteria that's consuming and producing a lactic acid, and that's in its essence what turns it into cheese, or what turns it into yogurt from being something else. And this allows for us as humans to have access to things that weren't readily available to us before. So we're using the bacteria and the yeast as sort of micro factories that convert. That's basically creating more with less. So that's why fermentation is so exciting to me, is that we actually have a potential to make more with less through fermentation. And if we can do this on industrial levels, we have cases in history that we'll talk about later that show that this can actually be very good business, very good for people, and incredibly good for the planet compared to the alternatives. And then the question was, how does this relate to drug production?
Yes.
As you said, drug production is a main emission driver in the healthcare sector. Why is that? Well, it's because when we produce a drug for a treatment, it's usually something tricky that needs to be extracted or produced in order to provide the desired effect. If we can cultivate bacteria or yeast that can help us as microfactories to produce these compounds, these APIs, then we have a potential to free up a lot of land mass that we would use. For instance, rosemary produces a compound. So the rosemary plant is producing a compound that we use for certain drugs.
The spice that we put on bread.
Yes, and it's a little shrub, bush plant. And a couple of hectares of that, of rosemary, will produce very few grams of this compound. So it's just to kind of put it into perspective, just how much land mass are we using right now to produce biological compounds.
So we're back to the big boiler kettle on the stove where you're making a sauce and you have to reduce a lot
and
spending material and energy.
And it's a very wasteful process. So on average, to produce 1 kilo of API, you're producing 23 kilos of waste. So it's an incredibly wasteful process in most shapes and forms, and that's why it's also an area with a huge potential for improvement if we can get this right. So that's why it excites me. And then of course, like any other person, I really enjoy a good bread or good beer or good cheese or good kombucha. So there's a lot of reasons to be in love with fermentation, but both as a professional and in advising my clients, there's a lot there's a lot of genuine advisory services there, but also as a private individual enjoying the fruits of life in particularly the beer and cheese and bread world. There's a lot to win.
I think a good way of understanding this journey and how the difference that fermentation can make could be to look at how did we used to make insulin for diabetes patients and how is it made today?
Yeah.
Could you try and walk us through? I mean,
I'll put on my history teacher glasses.
It's a 100-year journey, but if we just take the highlights from it.
Yeah. So let's just jump back in time to the 1970s. The way we produced insulin at a global level at that time was that we took the pancreas, that is the organ in the body that's producing insulin in mammals. We would take that from pigs, and in order to produce 1 pound of insulin, we would need 23,500 pigs. So just imagine, I don't know if you know what a pancreas looks like, but it's something wobbly organ-like, right? And just imagine the piles and piles and piles and piles and piles of pancreas that you would need in order to extract very little insulin in order to treat a relatively small group of patients. 23,500 for 1 pound.
Yeah.
I'm actually not sure if that's a British or an American pound, but let's just say half a kilo, and then we've been generous and no one's going to count the pigs anyway. We don't do it anymore.
And even though the meat from those pigs were eaten and the rest of it were hopefully used for other stuff, it's horribly inefficient. And
it's
it takes
incredibly
a lot of labor.
inefficient.
But it still saved the lives.
It saved a lot of lives, and that's kind of the big challenge with producing health or guiding health and aiding health at a societal level is going back to the oath you make as a doctor, the Hippocratic oath that you can do no harm. How much harm can we actually accept in order to deliver a treatment? And this is an interesting case, right? Because those were a lot of lives for the animals, but it was also a lot of lives for human patients. And where do we draw that line? How much can we pollute to provide one treatment, right? But that's how it was done in the 70s. We needed a lot of pigs to produce very little insulin. Then we came up with other means of production and fast forward
humanity and some great pharma companies, not you and me. Yeah.
And fast forward to today, where insulin production is a yeast-based fermentation process. So you have yeast cells that have been cultivated to produce insulin, and they're incredibly efficient at this. And the pig is not. The pig will only produce insulin in its pancreas, and that's proportionally a very small part of that pig. Compared to the yeast cell that's specialized and optimized for production of insulin, that's almost the only thing it does. And the byproduct can go into a biogas plant and produce biogas. So the waste becomes very, very small by comparison to the impact that it's providing and the improvement for patient lives.
And that's back to the precision part, where if you take a pig or a lot of other processes that it was in no way designed to produce insulin. In fact, through evolution, it was probably designed to spend the smallest amount of resources possible to produce just enough insulin for that pig. And through precision fermentation, we can make a targeted mini factory or machine that we can then put into a large factory.
Yeah, it's a culture of experts. It's literally a yeast culture, right? Where every individual in this culture are experts in producing insulin. That's all they do. That's what they're destined to do. You could almost say, to put it more philosophically. And another interesting aspect of that today is that being one of the key producers, there's one company in Denmark that sits on 50% of the global insulin production by becoming experts in this precision fermentation. So it's of course Novo Nordisk, and by accident they also created another massive company that could produce enzymes through precision fermentation in Novozymes, and it's just an area where I can't help but thinking that these are just two areas, and there's so many APIs out there in the world. So how might we design a world for an API production that is based on precision fermentation rather than the way it's done today? I think that's a very interesting question.
So what I hear you saying is that fermentation is not the default way of producing drugs,
Definitely
producing
not.
APIs.
And that's that spills into some other conversations. I won't go too deep into it, but allegedly the vast majority, like in close to 100% of the APIs in the world on a global level are produced in India and China, and those production activities are allegedly controlled and owned by something that can sort of be traced back to 6 family businesses. So we're also looking at an incredibly sensitive industry that the whole world is dependent on it, and it's at the end of the day it's controlled in 2 geographical areas by very few actors, and that just calls for business disruption.
Fermentation is another great example of a place where you have something, a technology, a way of production, a way of doing business that has a lot of benefits. Also requires you to do things differently and build up some knowledge and some know-how. But it has a lot of benefits, and without even talking about sustainability. That was not the reason why it was introduced into insulin production. That was more of an afterthought of like, oh, by the way, it's also, but it's because it's efficient. And when a lot of what we're working with our clients, when we do sustainability strategy work, is also future-proofing their businesses. Because change is a given in the world, perhaps now more than ever. And it's incredibly interesting to think when a CO2 tax comes, when you have to, as we get better and better at measuring CO2 emissions throughout the supply chain as well, also known as scope 3, how will this inflict? And I think that will be a driver for seeing a lot more fermentation in the future, I hope.
Yeah, we can only hope, right? And it's, I suppose it kind of has to become a driver if the national and public healthcare services are to reduce the impact, and 20% of that comes from the drug production, and that in its essence can be reduced dramatically through precision fermentation. It's just a logical way to go to future-proof the healthcare industry at large. So I think just for to kind of get our listeners back into the sort of very real world, and what you said there about developing expertise within this area. If anyone has gone to a craft beer bar, you will know that craft beer can be incredibly tasty or quite shitty. So I mean,
that's a high variance.
Yeah, there's a very high degree of variance, right? And that's despite the brewing of beer is a technique that we've been practicing as a human species for thousands of years. So even though we've been doing this since forever, you can still be very good or very bad at it. And I mean, of course, producing something is different from producing nothing. But I'm really passionate about craft beer, and I love a great IPA. And I recently learned that the IPAs that I like the most are the ones that were tapped yesterday or the day before it's actually tapped. If you can get it straight from the tank at the brewery, it just tastes absolutely magical. It's like
the fresher, the better for you.
It's like a floral explosion when you get a dry hopped IPA that's fresh from the tap, not from the tap in the bar, but the tap in the actual brewery. And what happens is that as an element in the beer production, brewers learned that if they took the flowers from the hop plant and put that into the brew, it would start tasting nice. It would give some aromas and some floral nuances and bitterness. Later on, craft brewers learned that if we take a tremendous amount of these dried hop flowers and then kind of use that as a super tea bag for the brew before we put it into kegs or into cans for producers to drink or for consumers to drink, then we will get this floral explosion effect. But what we forget here is that the hop flower comes from a plant that is not very good at producing a lot of flowers. So it's a plant that requires...
Just the tiny top.
It's just the flowers, right? And it's a plant that requires a lot of energy, a lot of space, a lot of sun, can only grow well for flavor purposes in very specific conditions. So this Danish startup company, Evodia Bio, has come up with a way to, through precision fermentation, produce what makes the hops flower tasty. They can produce that compound through precision fermentation. So they can actually ferment a product that mimics the effect of the hop flower that's used inside the beer, that's fermented, of course, in its own right, and reduce the environmental footprint by something, if I remember correctly, around 90%.
It's the same mechanism where take a lot of pigs to make not a lot of insulin, or to make a lot of hop fields to actually not make that many hop flowers. If you just produce it directly, there's a lot of sustainability potential.
Yeah, and I just think it's mind-boggling that you have a fermentation process that's supplementing the larger and most known fermentation process. So that's why I brought that example.
It's so interesting with APIs because, I mean, it's what creates the effect in the treatment, or supposed to be create the effect in the treatment. And yet, when you trace the steps for the APIs, or for a lot of drugs, and especially when we're talking generic drugs that are not branded, for so many actors in the healthcare industry, they will fall into scope 3. They'll be very far back in the supply chain, under some conditions we don't really like to talk about, and it's one of those things where the more we dig, the better we get at sustainability reporting. The more we start looking back in our supply chain, both all the way from the treatment, but also for the pharma companies that have outsourced these things or that are repackaging, etc. There's a lot of pollution happening there. Also, just because it's happening in some countries, but let's be honest, on average, just are less environmentally conscious. For the factories are less optimized for that. So even when fermentation or non-fermentation, it's also probably going to be in the least environmentally factories of all. So that is something that definitely needs to be fixed also, and where I fear the more we dig in the supply chains, the worse it gets, the longer we get back.
And I mean, it's something you also talked to Nicolina about in the episodes about greener labs, right? That if we look into how things are made, a lot of the seasoned professionals that have been working in an industry for decades, they might not even know where some of the substances they're working with in the lab comes from. They just order, a quantity in a database, and then it's delivered to them. And building that transparency is also going to be a driver for change when we start learning, okay, is this really how we're doing things? And precision fermentation is just a way to sort of take back control and transparency and do something that's very easy to understand compared to a lot of the alternatives. And then, it's very cost effective. That will be the main driver for this switch. Then by accident is also incredibly impactful from an environmental perspective, and that's of course also one of the reasons why we are promoting it. That one of our core thoughts is that it has to be profitable and it has to be sustainable.
Yeah. I guess that sums up most of our projects. That it was the cost driver that opened the door, and then we helped our clients deliver the sustainable results through that. Thank you so much for coming in, Frederik.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
it was a pleasure.
Always good. I hope you enjoyed the episode. One of my pleasures in the job is to talk to Frederik. I do enjoy it. If you are curious on how your organization and you can start working with the circular economy in the pharma or medtech sector, do check out our white paper on circularity at greeninnovationgroup.com. Have a great day and thank you for listening.